The first sequence this week is natural selection speed limit and complexity bound. And this is a very interesting post because it has revisions. What do you call it? Revisions?
Yeah, like he made mistakes the first time through, and then I actually read the comments on this one. There was like this back and forth between him and Scott Aronson, the
math guy,
and
not the Slate Star Codex guy.
It's just a very atypical sequence post where it's just like, okay, I guess I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah, I like the fact that it's something that he put out there, turned out to be wrong, and then there's like a whole, this is the mistakes that were made, and here are, what we found to actually be the case, and the original error is still out there and preserved so that people can see what it's like to, be wrong and update and correct.
Yeah.
Sure would be nice if other news sites and article writers would do that.
Yeah. I mean, you can't expect everyone to not be evil.
I guess not. So how fast is natural selection, or isn't it?
Who knows, man? Yeah, like everything got hung up on this debate about like what is the definition of a bit, because Eliezer was saying like evolution can only do one bit of selection per generation, and then people were like, that's nonsense. And it's like, well, it depends. Are you talking about an information theoretic bit or computer science bit? And then it just moved beyond my capacity to follow the argument, frankly.
So the information theoretical bit is the amount of information needed to eliminate half the possibilities, yes?
That's what he said in the post, and I'll just have to take his word for it.
Okay.
Same. I'm like, if you say so.
Right. So I think I remember this going back to one of his posts about presidential elections, but like at the very end, all the voters have their chance to give one bit of information, selecting between the R and the D candidate, and to go from the population of the U.S. to one the one last bit needed at the end. You got to go through like something like 16, 18 bits beforehand. He's like, what the hell happened that the other 17 bits were taken out of the voters' choices? Why are they only deciding on the last one? Which was an interesting post, but not one that we're talking about today. So, I will.
Yeah, but in both of those cases, I think I initially just thought that there was a sort of casual reference to bits. I didn't realize that they had formal definitions. I thought it was just like a piece of information, basically, like the smallest chunk. But yeah, no, apparently it actually means something.
In the example,
several different things, possibly.
Like we have colloquialisms like tidbit or a little bit of this.
Exactly.
a skosh.
Right. Well, but I mean, things that use the word bit.
One skosh of information.
Right. Can you pass me a bit of creamer for my coffee? Like this is. So when I think bit, I think, okay, small piece.
A small amount,
right?
Yeah.
See, I always thought of bit as a one or as a programming background. And that actually makes, it sort of falls in line with the information theoretic thing, because with a 1 or a 0, there's two possibilities, made half of the ability.
I guess,
so it sort of makes sense to me.
Actually, that's a really good mnemonic. That's probably also what that references.
Well, that's like why you can play 20 questions with a not that sophisticated robot and have it guess right, because it's like, is it a solid, yes or no, and that eliminates like a huge possibility of space, right? And that's one bit of information.
Yeah. The example he gave in this post was if parents had 16 children and only 2 survived, that's 3 bits of it, as you have the number of children 3 times.
Yeah. So the point of him even having this here, right, is to talk about optimization processes, because like the whole point of the sequences is to convince everyone that AGI is a massive risk, and to do that he convinces you that AGI is going to be way more powerful than something really slow and stupid like evolution, and so he's making fun of evolution being so slow, basically.
Yes. And the thing that he the thing that he talks about natural selection speed limit is the fact that natural selection works by killing off things with that are less adapted, and the adaptations happen through random mutation. And when a mutation happens, for most of them are the vast amount are deleterious, and to get rid of deleterious genes in the population, things have to die off.
I like to think of it as, or like to simplify that to random mutations and non-random death.
Yes,
that's how evolution works.
But since the mechanism of action is death, it means that out of every generation, you can only get rid of so many deleterious mutations without, losing the entire gene pool. There's too many mutations to get rid of them all. You'd have to kill them. That's bad.
Yeah. So that was the most subtle point that I don't think I even really grok, is the idea that there's a maximum size to any genome, which is determined by the mutation rate, and the argument being like, if the mutation rate is X, then you need some amount of ongoing natural selection just to filter out the deleterious mutations, and thus that tells you the maximum size of the genome.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, I guess that makes sense. I'm not convinced that his argument actually proves it, and that's what a lot of the argument in the comments was about, but sure, whatever.
Intuitively, that makes sense, though. If, like, genes had a 1% error rate when replicating, they couldn't be 4 billion pairs long, right?
Because, like, everyone would just die of mutation.
Yeah.
If they had a 1% error rate, then 1% of the population would have to die every generation to keep the DNA sequence from deteriorating into completely.
I wouldn't even say the species. I'd say, like, the individual cells, right? Like, so I mean, I guess what I mean is that among just DNA replication, which happens all the time in each individual organism.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that would, if an error rate of 1% would just wreck that organism pretty quickly.
I mean, it does over the course of a few decades.
But I mean, pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The right.
Yeah.
I think the mutation doesn't keep happening,
And-
or some of them. I mean, like a lot of mutations sort of happen and impair like the development of the creature, but then it like doesn't keep mutating.
And the rate is also really important. Like, as you said, a 1% error rate would murder things. And according to what it says here in the post, that among mammals, the rate of DNA copying errors is roughly 1 in 10 to the negative 8th per base pair per generation, which is 1 in 100 million. So much lower than 1%.
Yeah. Basically nothing on average, because most of your DNA sequence doesn't do anything. Yeah.
There's I forget the number, but there's some like number of mutations that the average person has, and I feel like it's in the tens or something.
In like the copied genes, though. Although there are some species that have less junk DNA than so that's also kind of interesting, but probably I don't know, overly complicated since we already are confusing ourselves with this.
But the interesting thing that he points out is that if we assume a error correction rate of 1 bit per generation, which is actually, I guess, when it comes down to it later on, the thing that this hinged on that is most in question, which is why what he proposed was wrong. But if you assume 1 bit of selection pressure per generation, that means that in a species that has an error rate of 1 per 100 million, that means you are at most going to have 100 million meaningful base pairs that encode something, because you can correct 1 per 100 million per generation, which is basically what he comes down to. Near at the end, he says the Human Genome Project gave final confirmation when it announced that humans probably only had 20 to 25,000 protein coding genes. 25,000 genes plus regulatory regions will fit within 100 million base pairs with lots of room to. So yeah, that is the primary half of the thrust of the original article.
There was one thing about this article that bothered me, actually, was that he kept using the word complexity. Mm-hmm. Number one, I thought that was a word that he warned us not to use. But
did he agree on this before this, or was that something he wrote after, though?
I don't know. I should have looked that up.
Because maybe he was beating himself up about it.
Maybe. But I was specifically, even if he hadn't already warned us about this, I was like, what do you mean by complex? Like, he says sentences in there, like, or maybe it's in the comments, he says stuff like, a giraffe probably isn't more complex than a stegosaurus. And I'm like, what do you mean by complex?
I think what he means is that requires more than 100 billion base pairs to encode everything meaningful.
You think he just means that maybe stegosaurus had a bigger genome than giraffe?
Either that or, used the same amount of information, just encoded different things. Because
maybe
one of the major, I think what the major point was by the time you get to the end of this is that since you can only correct 1 out of every 100 million, that means you have per generation. That means you have an effective upper limit of 100 million coding base pairs, which means that once you're using all of those, you can't get like even more complex. You can't get even more information shoved into a gene code. What you end up doing is reducing one type of complexity, reducing the information needed to encode one thing in order to increase the complexity of something else. Like some parts of your genome are going to get simpler and not as needing as many base pairs to encode what they do in order to make other things more complicated.
Good answer.
Yeah.
That's complexity is a loaded word. Inyasha and I argued about it a couple episodes ago on the Not Everything is a Clue podcast.
Yeah.
I think that's one of those words that, Eliezer or other rationalists have sort of just tried to ban. Well, I'm trying to remember the other one, too. It was, emergent.
Yeah.
That's another word that doesn't mean anything. So, like, how is AI going to become sentient? Oh, sentience is an emergent trait. That's not an answer.
The bolded thing that I pulled out of this one was, the direct quote that I bolded and pulled out was, natural selection probably hit its complexity bound no more than 100 million generations after multicellular organisms got started. Since then, over the last 600 million years, evolutions have substituted new complexity for lost complexity rather than accumulating adaptations.
Which, maybe.
Yeah.
And in conclusion, haha, evolution's dumb.
Well, in conclusion, we have the thing at the very end that happened where there was, he made the argument that basically you could, due to this upper limit on complexity, code everything meaningful about a human genome in 25 megabits, due to how bits and information bits and computer bits are, similar enough that you can there was an argument.
And then didn't that turn out to not be the case?
That turned out to not be the case when someone tried to create a computer program to actually model this, to simulate it. They ran into a thing where it didn't reach that limit. It kept going up like at a increasing, like it was an exponential taper, right? Rather than hitting that limit. And there was a lot of talk about this. And when you go to the wiki, the summary at the bottom of the wiki is, the first part being the idea of an upper bound on the sustainable information in a genome, and that mammals are already at this upper bound, has been for tens of millions of years, if not longer, is not original to Yudkowsky. It's an example from George Williams' Adaptations and Natural Selections.
Plagiarism.
Yes.
Probably not.
The computer simulation failed to bear out the bound, and the flaw... Well, he specifically credited George...
Oh, then never mind.
George Williams, in the post. But the flaw appears to have been as follows. Even if one mutation creates one death, which is where the whole you can only do one bit of information per generation comes from, this does not mean that one death eliminates only a single mutation. Organisms bearing more deleterious mutations are more likely to lose the evolutionary competition, and so each death can eliminate more mutations than average. If mating is random, then...
Which is not, but
then
anyway.
Information supportable in the genome goes as the inverse square of the mutation rate, which basically ups the bound on how complex something can be if you can have more than one bit of selection correction in a generation.
Cool.
Yeah.
Therefore, evolution's not dumb and bad. Just kidding, it still is.
It is both still dumb and bad, but the upper bound might not be quite as low as was theorized in this post. At the very end of the wiki, it says, it basically summarizes all the various inputs that went into this, including Fisher's limit to how much selection a population could sustain, Kimura's mutation rates, and again, Wallace's original upper bound argument. It ends with, if we assume that only Yudkowsky's attempt at a novel contribution actually failed, and that we should go on trusting the other authors, then on the whole, it is still safe to say that evolutionary biologists think there are speed limits and complexity bounds, just not that the complexity bound is 25 megabits as calculated the way Yudkowsky tried to calculate it. So, upper bound, got to trade some complexity for other complexity, but it's not quite at the place where Yudkowsky was trying to say.
It was a cool idea, though. Like, I actually appreciate that it's still preserved, so you could see the thought process and the retraction, or revision, or whatever they called it.
Yeah. I like the fact that he tried to put like a solid number on it, even if it didn't bear out. Just having the vague idea that there is an upper bound that is traded against is less seen like having it's too bad we don't have that number.
Do we not have that number? Is it incalculable, or has anyone calculated it yet?
I think it varies by enough things, like how many people die, how many beneficial or deleterious mutations are.
Like it's just too chaotic?
Yeah.
Well, that's neat.
But I'm also not an evolutionary biologist, so I could be wrong about this. That is just my understanding from reading these posts and doing a little bit of wiki work.
And we didn't define deleterious. We mean just bad mutations.
Things that make it less likely that you will have offspring.
Yeah, like there's benign mutations. I don't know, like a deer's born with 3 horns instead of 2 or something, which like maybe would just be fine, but not really convey any advantage or disadvantage. So deleterious would be if it was like born with a horn growing out of its brain.
Right.
It's a particularly bad one.
But
yeah, maybe those weren't the best examples. That's what my brain went to. I don't have the best brain here.
Maybe like a different shade of brown versus having no hair at all, or no fur. But I just wanted to raise the point that like deleterious mutations are going to be way more likely just because there's a lot more ways to fuck things up than there are to make things better.
Yeah.
Which is why that's what they say the why there is an upper limit, because most things are bad and mostly selection is working to keep things. I feel like I drove way too much and doing a lot of talking. Does someone else want to drive more for the next LessWrong post?
Well, We need to apparently beware of Stephen Jay Gould.
Why do we need to be aware? Beware, not be aware. I guess you have to be aware of him before you can beware of him.
Actually,
but
yeah, what the word means, or
I think beware is more connotations of danger. Be on
Anyway.
guard.
Be wary, I would say. Yeah.
Yes.
this is what happens when I try to drive. Foolish evolutionary biologists, say Gould, believe that evolution has a preferred tendency towards progress and the accumulation of complexity. But of course, Gould kindly explains this is simply a statistical illusion.
What is the problem with Gould saying this?
There was a time when many evolutionary biologists had a romantic conception of progress. Evolution climbed ever higher. They were climbing these ever higher mountains of complexity, dinosaur to dog to man, or like sort of brings to mind that T-shirt that I hate of the like March of Evolution that shows an ape like turning into a human and standing proudly as though like this were the pinnacle.
Right.
I had a friend once talk to me. We were talking about Star Trek, and I was mentioning, because we're talking about real aliens in space and how they would look nothing like, basically humans with makeup. He's like, well, isn't this like the optimal form put forward by? And I'm like, not precisely. Yeah, not. I didn't want to like get into like too much with him. But I'm like, that's just not how it. No, that's not how it works. That's how it happened here, right? There's no reason to think it would be anything like that on another planet, especially one that's like way different.
I can name so many reasons why humans are like poorly designed, actually.
Let's start with the spine.
Oh my god, yes. Fuck spines. But anyway, so there was a hero who challenged this widespread misconception. George Williams.
Not Stephen Jay Gould.
Not Stephen Jay Gould.
Yes.
His challenge was successful, and saying the things he did didn't make him a heroic, persecuted martyr. He simply won. His arguments were accepted, and biology moved on. In fact, the shift to a gene's eye view in evolutionary theory is sometimes called the Williams Revolution.
Is it? Huh.
I mean, I don't know. I don't
Probably
know
among
a lot of
evolutionary biologists.
Yeah, I don't know very many, so I'm again taking this from the post.
It's sometimes, at least once, called Williams evolution here in this post.
In this post.
I don't know when Williams did his thing, but
66.
I know that. Okay, yeah. So Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, was in 1975, and I think that popularized this view anyway. At least among the public, it wasn't a scientific paper.
I
It was
remember a lot
giant
of people
book.
still arguing about it at the time. The selfish gene theory, I mean. I don't know if that's relevant, but I just remember finding it really funny that part of it was like a scientific argument, and then part of it was that non-scientists thought that he was trying to say that because genes are selfish, that means that like humans are inherently selfish, and that like selfishness is good.
Yeah. Right. When in fact Ken selection is totally compatible with the gene's eye view, which this is another weird post, right? Because it's Eliezer at his more polemical and firebrandy, and he's not just like he's like fuck this Gould guy basically. In fact, this is another one where you read in the comments and some people are like, I think you're being a little hard on him. He's like, no, actually, fuck him. It's
or beware of him. Anyway.
Yeah.
I just had a dust up with a friend. I don't know if you want to call it a dust up. Sometimes you can get dusty and still have fun. But like a dust up with a friend in a Discord server about a very similar kind of thing, where someone was trying to do the same sort of thing Gould is doing. I'm like, fuck that person and all their bullshit. It's like, but what he's saying is correct. I'm like, yeah, it's correct, but fuck him for trying to imply that everybody else thinks the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, nobody knows what we're talking about yet because we haven't gotten to the meat of this post. If Gould had simply stolen Williams' ideas and presented them as his own, then he would have been guilty of plagiarism. And yet, at least the general public would have been accurately informed in that sense. Less damage would have been done to the public understanding of science. But Gould's conduct was much stranger. He wrote as if the entire Williams Revolution had never occurred. Gould attacked, as if they were still current views, romantic notions that no serious biologist had put forth since the 1960s. Gould undid the last 30 years of progress in his depiction of the field that he was criticizing, pretending that evolutionary theory was in chaos, so he could depict himself as heroically bringing order to it.
This reminds me of every time that like science publications or science news, I guess, sites are still like, was Einstein wrong? I'm just like, no. Like, stop. And then sure enough, you read the article and it was like, nope. We thought maybe he was for a few seconds there, but nope.
Isn't that just a rule of the web? If you read a news headline with a question, the answer is always no.
Is that, yeah, actually,
Basically.
I'm trying to think of counterexamples and having a hard time.
Can bees think?
Gould systemically misrepresented what other scientists thought. he deluded the public as to what evolutionary biologists were thinking.
Yes. Stephen.
And therefore, watch out for him. He's like creeping around in dark alleys and
You remember being part of the atheist.
Yeah.
Actually, we're all of
Good
us
times.
here part
Yeah.
of the atheist.
Oh, yeah.
Wars? Okay, yeah. But it would be almost like if someone came around and saying that, like, or
also-
like, how could morality possibly work? Atheists were always saying that there is, without God, everything is permitted. But I have this theory about how actually it makes life better for everyone on Earth if we follow morality, and therefore I am a genius.
Are you just trying to, like, intuition pump why you would be angry about this?
Yeah,
Okay.
because if you've been going on for 30 years not thinking that everything is permitted, and you know that everyone else in atheism doesn't think that, we don't go around raping and murdering, and someone comes around who's like, I am an atheist and I have found the answer. Like, no, fuck you. Why are you trying to tell everybody that the rest of us are immoral monsters who are just now hearing about why not to rape and murder?
What's fun is that's usually done like as just straw manning other people's positions that you don't like. You'll give some terrible interpretation of it and act like it's this, you know, this
Evolutionists
bad
think
idea.
that, like,
Yeah.
life just appeared.
Yeah, your grandpa was a monkey, but like that's usually where they stop. And then if you're just going to, you know, straw man somebody, but they're trying to like, but no, here I am with the solution.
Yes.
And it's like, but we've all been aware of the solution.
Yeah.
It's like if someone tried to pretend like their new essay on why you shouldn't torture animals was like groundbreaking.
Right.
And it's like, but this is not a new thought. You don't get to get credit for thinking like ahead of the curve here.
It's not just that you don't get to get credit. It's the fact that you are making everyone else think that we all think it's okay to torture
Yeah,
animals.
you come in and you're like, well, as we all know, it's okay to torture animals, right? But look at my new thesis.
Yeah.
Just like, what? Nobody was... Go away.
That's funny.
And it's specifically when you're a beleaguered minority that has lots of lies told about it anyway, that is what's particularly... Like, if you were an evolutionary biologist at the time of atheism, and someone goes around saying this kind of shit, you'd be like, fuck you.
Okay, now
I
I
imagine,
get
right?
Yeah.
why you brought up atheism wars, because evolutionary biology was pretty... I guess continues to be, like, kind of a hard field to be in, because there's so much idiocy about it. Well, so yeah...
Does anyone
what are
think
we
that he was
reading
being
next
too harsh
time?
on Gould in this?
Well, so one thing which I don't know if it even necessarily came across in the post is like Gould was like a famous popularizer. Like he wrote a lot of like well-regarded books. So this would be like, I don't know, if Neil deGrasse Tyson or someone was just constantly full of shit about astronomy or something. Where it's like it's way more offensive because he's so successul at being a, you know, he's the guy, right?
Like, because, you know, people will read this book,
Yeah.
and who, like, don't know...
Right.
You know, if they're not an evolutionary biologist or haven't followed the field, they'd be like, oh, he is a hero. Wow, I can't believe everybody thought this other dumb thing. And
Yeah.
it's just like, no.
Right. I remember being like having my back put up by this post actually because I had read a book by Stephen Jay Gould before I read the sequences, and I was like,
That bastard.
he's just attacking
Sorry.
my friend Stephen Jay Gould, which, you know, it's funny, I don't really remember the Gould book, so it must not have been very good. But
Whoops.
But yeah, you said Selfish Gene came out in 75.
Selfish Gene was 76. So Gould's running around saying that like he's the first person to talk about the gene-centric view of evolution in the 90s.
More importantly, that everyone else still believed the opposite. And
That's weird.
yeah.
It just like that's the kind of stuff you could get away with, you know, a century earlier maybe.
Yeah, but it's also like he had to have known, right? Because I did catch myself like, maybe he just like assumed that was the view and wasn't just being self-aggrandizing. But no, I don't think so. He probably...
In the post, Eliezer quotes several sources. Like, we have tried to talk to him specifically.
He's locked himself in his room. He's like, no, I'm not taking any interviews, especially not if it's about that book.
yeah, I mean, unfortunately, even just my sort of normal amount of exposure to academia in getting a PhD has exposed me to so many professors and just academics in general who are just so obsessed with credit and recognition. And like you know that they're just gonna exaggerate how much of a role they had in whatever the thing is, and you can totally buy that there's just like a type of person who would pretend that they invented evolution, you know, because
Isn't that the entire character of Professor Slughorn in Harry Potter?
I think so. Yes,
He
that
was
is
the
yeah.
teacher that they had to manipulate to get him back to tell like everybody what he knew about Voldemort by being like, we've got these students who are really great, and then you could take credit for them being really great by being their teacher. And he's just like, no, I must not say anything about the Dark Lord. I'm scared of it. Wait, what credit?
Matt, have you ever been in a conversation with a non-rationalist who, when they learn about, you know, the rationalist idea, is like, oh, so you guys are a bunch of robots that that don't believe emotions are important and you can just think your way out of anything?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, and then if I were to come up and say, yes, that is what all of them believe, especially Matt here, but I have this new idea about how emotions are actually very important heuristics that get us through the day.
Yeah, and in fact, you might even need to have some kind of training regimen or organization in order to make it so that you could become more rational effectively.
Oh my god, it was a good segue.
That was a fantastic segue, so we should segue right after we tell the people what our next posts will be.
I suppose.
For next week, we will be reading and talking about The Tragedy of Group Selectionism. Ooh, is this the one that's the inspiration for the bugs from Three Worlds Collide?
Oh, is it?
Maybe.
Sounds related.
Yeah.
Oh, that's exciting.
And also Fake Selfishness.